Hello, my name is Dorian Ellen Beldotan in Sfat in Israel. I'm making a second part of the video that I started, Meet the Rothschilds bosses. Very pleased that it was popular. I got 1,000 views on it in the first day, which is, I think, a world record for me. I'm still a little, so please excuse me. But I think I look almost human, right? I can smile and everything. In order to understand what's going on in the world today in general, one has to understand the Jews' betrayal of the covenant that we made with God when some of us went into Babylon and liked it there. There was one prophet who saw that the Babylonian exile was going to be a protracted exile, that the Jews were going to like it there, was Yirmiyahu. He saw it, which is what made him so sad. Most of the prophets, as I said, didn't think the Jews were going to like it there much, that they were going to get to Babylon, be sorry, and regret what they did and want to come back home. He understood that the Jews were going to like it. And this is why his book is so terribly heartbroken. But it's also promising. And we are now fulfilling the prophecy of our holy teacher Yirmiyahu. And we're going to see the return of what's called She'arit Yisrael, those who remained loyal to Israel, those who remained Israel, the return to Israel. Before that happens, there are going to be all kinds of upheavals in the world, and we see that happening. It's all under control. If you take a look at what's going on in Hawaii, you see that despite an unprecedented in known history explosion of a volcano, it's very, very controlled. There are floods going on, as we know. This is not the result of the Illuminati doing this. Quite the opposite. It's the level above the Illuminati who are using their own hands and their own equipment to bring that about, because I told you that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, but the master of the master can. So we're just showing them who's boss. I bought this book called The Sephardi Story some years ago. It's written by the name of Chaim Raphael. I guess I should say Chaim Raphael, right? A celebration of Jewish history, such as it is. And I looked into this because when my mother, Alea Shalom, was ill, a series of blood samples were run on her, and they found that we are not Ashkenazim as we thought, that we are very, very Mizrahi. They told my mother she had blood that they'd never seen anything like this in North America. She said, you have a blood sample like you walked out of the Middle East yesterday. So I began to look into what this means, and I bought this book. And it was in this book that I learned about Dangur, the Dangur family, for the first time. And it says, in a different form again, the personal side of the Sephardi story has been given new life in our time through the Exilarch's foundation of Naim Dangur, whose magazine, The Scribe, unifies the family memories of Eastern Sephardim all over the world. In this book, we're going to see just how deep the connection of the Jews became to Babylon. We're going to begin to understand what that wrought in the world, And we're going to begin to understand why, despite the temporary inconvenience, the decision has been made on high to plow it under and wash it away. So I'm going to read some short excerpts which are very telling from this book, and you'll understand things that are talked about the Jews and the Illuminati and all kinds of things in misunderstood ways in a far more clear kind of way. He writes, in one sense, indeed, the Sephardi story begins with the origin of the patriarch Abraham in Babylonia and the reformulation there of Jewish life at a later stage in history. From this we understand that by going back to Babylon and taking up residence there and liking it there, those Jews committed the worst kind of betrayal of the covenant that Hashem made with Avraham. Hashem said to Avraham, Lech lecha, go out, get out of here. And here they are coming back. It is not always realized how strong the links of this golden age with the continued Jewish settlement is in Babylon. The authority exercised by the Jews of Babylon had its roots many centuries earlier, during the exiles of the Jews from their kingdoms in Israel in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. The exiles had established a rich life there. They had their own ruler, the exilarch, and now he renews the exilarch, right? A descendant of King David. Jewish history and law enshrined in the Bible. Enshrined in the Bible? What is it, dead? Was now the source of a new diffusion of Jewish experience spreading from Babylonian academies across the world. It was this free-flowing Jewish culture from Babylon that laid the base in time for the meaningful survival of Jews everywhere in the world. Oh, so without that, our lives wouldn't be meaningful. I want you to understand the mentality of how these traders think about Babylon. Over thousands of years, the ebb and flow of the Jewish presence there, meaning Babylon, has taken many forms, notably the outstanding role played by Jews in administration and finance, with its influence spreading today into many countries of the Sephardi diaspora. On a world scale, it was from Iraq that a number of Jews spread powerfully and beneficially into the Indian and Chinese empires, opening up and transforming the Far East to lasting effect. First of all, I want you to understand that everything that is going on now with the wars in the Middle East, in Iraq, in Iran, this is all going back to Babylon, to the Assyrian empires, to the Mesopotamian empires. This is what is being cleared away. But when it says here they spread powerfully and beneficially into the Indian and Chinese empires, like what? Opium? Building opulent hotels? Like what kind of beneficial things did they bring these countries? If anything, they brought them absolute misery. It is therefore only one phase of this tradition that in our own time, prominent Sephardi personalities from Iraq emerged as they had before to exert their traditional influence on the Jewish world at large. They are trying to take over. They are trying to make the whole world into Babylon. And we're going to talk about this, please God. Names are far too numerous to list, but perhaps one can mention two that are symbolic. The first would be Naim Dan Gur, grandson of the famous Hacham Bashi, chief rabbi Hacham Ezra Dan Gur, and an imaginative projector from his base in London of a new expression of the central role of the exilarch in times gone by. In 1970, exactly 700 years after the death in 1270 of the last known exilarch, Naim Dangor established the Exilarch's Foundation, endowed with funds to help the young, but on a broader basis to restore the links everywhere of Jews of Babylonian descent through a journal he called the Scribe, sent all over the world. And then they speak about another, but I want to concentrate on that. In an equally distinctive way, the memory of Babylon is celebrated by the philanthropists. They all call themselves philanthropists. That's a watchword for misanthropist. Dr. David Salah, who played a dominant role in education and Zionist work in Iraq itself, followed now in England, where he and his wife Irene, until her sad death this year, developed highly personal programs on a very large scale to help Sephardi youths in Israel to rise to their full potential. Chara Balebin. Everything was done to trample Sephardim underfoot in the state of Israel. There is no more powerful illustration. Excuse me, I'm going to go back. These local loyalties have enduring meaning, even if in Israel today the common purpose might seem to transcend them. Listen to what he's saying. He's saying that in Israel today they might seem to be transcending their loyalties to Babylon, but don't you be fooled. We're still deeply rooted in Babylon. Woo-hoo. There is no more powerful illustration of this than the theme which surfaces so often in this book, the ancient attachment of the Jews to Babylon. One sometimes feels that it has a quasi-mystic quality of the kind that is echoed, strangely enough, in the words of an old English nursery rhyme. How many miles to Babylon? 70 miles and 10. Can I get there by candlelight? Yes, and back again. Now listen carefully. Tradition relates that Akkad was built 2300 BC. Now watch what he did. First he said BCE. Now he calls it BC. All of a sudden his loyalties switch. He starts to speak in Christian terms. By a mighty ruler named Sargon, who had been cast out and later rescued as an infant, just as is told of Moses 1,000 years later. Sargon created an empire stretching as far as Anatolia to the north and beyond Assyria to the east. Why is this important today? Because when Trump opened up the American embassy in Yerushalayim, no, he didn't, I correct myself, in Jerusalem. He has never set foot in Yerushalayim, and the way he's going, he never will. They coined a coin. They're showing Trump's face superimposed upon that of Sargon. Not Darius, who allowed the Jews to return to Israel and rebuild the temple, but Sargon, the person who founded the Akkadian Empire. And in a video that they made, they take this coin and they show it on a model of the third temple. Netanyahu 3 times mentions the temple in his speech at the new embassy. So we understand that what they're planning on doing is building the third temple in accordance with Babylon. In other words, the New World Order, what they plan is the final incursion, the final takeover of Israel by Babylon. Good luck with that, folks. And let me remind you, Israel is situated on a tectonic fault. Just saying. Behind all the law expressed in the Bible is the belief, wholly original to Israel, that moral action is imitatio Dei, is the imitation of God. Moral action, not spirituality, not contemplation, moral action. That is what we are on about. Israel is to be a holy nation reaching out to God's holiness. That is absolutely correct. So what is it that they do in Babylon? The Bible texts expressing this are linked indissolubly to the Holy Land itself. Correct. They are given as motivational force behind the exodus from Egypt and the achievement of a homeland fulfilling God's promise to Abraham. Correct. Yet, what do you mean yet? Yet one has to note, perhaps with awe, that it was in Babylon during the first exile from the Holy Land that supreme emphasis was put on this spiritual aspect of Torah teaching. Did you just get what he said? First he says, correctly so, that the land is indissolubly connected with moral action. Action. In Babylon, all of a sudden this becomes spiritual. So what they do is they introduce spirituality into Torah. There's no spirituality in Torah. Torah is the translation of God's will into actuality. We're not on about spirituality at all. We're on about actuality. They introduce spirituality, which, as I've said before, and will probably say again, is the occult. Okay. But in the meantime, I'm not reading the whole thing so as not to bore you too much. In the lead up to the age of Hillel, authority had to flow from devoted Bible teachers in the Holy Land, but they flowed into Babylon. They started to leave Israel and go to Babylon. And it says here, in political terms, this emphasis became less dominating after the temple had been rebuilt. Members of the priestly clan exploited their authority to win power and wealth, which is exactly what they want to do in the rebuilding of this Kakamemi third temple of theirs, in an atmosphere of corruption and social unrest. First, you create an atmosphere of corruption and social unrest, and then you use it. But if this, as in the writings of Josephus show, was the public pattern, there must also have been an untold story which flowed directly from Ezra's exposition of the Torah and which reached back to the beginning of Torah study in Babylon itself. This, in effect, is how it was that a Babylonian, Hillel, could become the rabbinic leader of the Jews in Israel. And let me tell you, when the Dead Sea, the Jews at the Dead Sea who wrote HaMegillot, who wrote the Dead Sea sect, I don't like calling them a sect, spoke about an evil rabbi, the timeline in which they speak about an evil rabbi puts it right at Hillel. Hillel, in the rabbinical tradition, is revered. But the Jews who left Jerusalem and settled in Qumran and wrote the Megillot had a different story to tell about him, about he persecuted the righteous priests. And it was Hillel who is said to have instituted prose bull, which allowed for usury and gave a legalistic out for not allowing the Jews to have their land back every 7 years in the sabbatical year. And eventually they did away with the Yovlot, the Jubilees, altogether. This, in effect, is how it was that a Babylonian Hillel could become the rabbinic leader of the Jews in Israel. Bible study had continued in Babylon after the, and he puts it like in one quote, the return. In other words, he's saying there never really was a return, that they always had their center in Babylon. So he doesn't take the Jews who wanted to come back to Israel seriously at all. The return, like putting it in quotes. Ready, as we shall see, to reach the high standards of Israel itself. So they start to now compete with Israel. Half-jokingly, the Jews of Babylon would claim that they were superior to those of Israel. They would never dispute the basic holiness of Jerusalem, with which nothing could compare, but, I mean but, with the yet, with the but, you get it? Ifs, ands, and buts, and yets. But in material terms, they were far more prosperous. And the head of their self-government, the Reish Galuta, the head of the exile, which I told you is also called the capstone, was a direct descendant of King David, or so they claimed. All countries, said one rabbi, are second-rate compared to the land of Israel, and the land of Israel is second-rate compared with Babylonia. This is a bad translation. Let me tell you what it actually says. It says that all countries are the dough for the land of Israel, and the land of Israel is the dough for Babylon. In other words, what he's saying is, you know the expression half-baked? Well, he's saying not baked at all. In other words, what he's trying to say was the land of Israel was just the dough for Babylon, which is the actual bread. Really. But the Holy Land was still weakening in its leadership, and the Jewish people compared with the burgeoning strength of Babylon. Reversing the earlier trend, the flow of scholars was now from Palestine to Babylon. Listen to what he does. Listen to what he does. First he was calling it Israel. Now, when he starts to talk about reversing the flow of rabbis leaving Israel and going to Babylon, he suddenly calls it Palestine. Ooh. So now we know where all of this fomenting the idea of Palestine comes from. Naim Dan-Gur's father was the largest supplier of books in Arabic in the world, as I said in my last video. Is there a more perfect vehicle for brainwashing the Arab masses? Half of his family have Arabic names. Yeah. Even when there are Hebrew equivalents of those names. And all of a sudden they're talking about Palestine. So now we know that it's not the Palestinians who were the origin of all of this propaganda about Israel not belonging to the Jews. It's the Babylonians, the traitors. The Jews themselves are fomenting this idea that the Jews are in Palestine. No, darlings, the Jews are in Israel. The turning point had come in AD 219. Now this is interesting. First he talked about BCE, before the Christian era. Then he talked about BC. All of a sudden he's sounding like a Christian sort of. Now he's talking AD. So who exactly are these people's gods? They're a little bit loyal to Allah, and they're a little bit loyal to Jesus, and they're a little bit loyal to, it's like a mishmash here. And a little bit probably to the Akkadian gods and the Babylonian gods. You know that they renamed all of the names of the Hebrew months with the names of Babylonian gods? Do you know that? Every name of all of the Hebrew months today is the name of a Babylonian deity. Really. Okay. The turning point came in AD 219 with the arrival there of a distinguished rabbi, Rabbi Aricha, affectionately known as Rab. Working with a Babylonian rabbi called Shmuel, Rab founded study centers through which the fame of Babylonian scholarship became universally acknowledged. The population of Babylon had been described by Josephus in his book Jewish Antiquities as countless myriads of which none can know the number. Philo, the Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, had written in the same vein of the very large number of Jews in every city in the lands beyond the Euphrates. The two major yeshivot academies, founded or expanded by Rab and Shmuel, were at Sura and Nehardea, Oxford and Cambridge of Jewish Babylonia. Oh, really? Perhaps that's the reason why they have those posh accents. Both academies attracted masses of ordinary people who turned to study side by side with ordinary work as an enlargement of life. In each year, work in the fields came to a standstill in Adar, which is the name of one of their Babylonian gods, February, March. And in Elul, I don't even need to say what, August, September, it was then that the students flocked to the academies. In Rab's time, Sura alone had 1,200 regular students. Nehardea was succeeded after a time by a similar academy in Pumbedita, and additional academies were founded elsewhere in Babylonia. But the two major academies remained the pivot of Jewish life respected throughout the world, and that is the reason why you have Cambridge and Oxford in Israel today, according in England today. From my mouth to God's ears. On this model. Okay, it talks about the Jews' large, extensive land holdings. The exilarch, not surprisingly, was the greatest landowner. These are merely some aspects of Jewish study and economic existence in Babylonia, while the foundations were being laid for its unique role in taking over from the Holy Land in many respects. I am talking to you about the plan of Hasatan to take over from Hashem. Do you understand me? The plan was to wrest the earth from Hashem. Understand what is being talked about here. Good luck with that, boys and girls. Yes. Now listen. Iraq Jews carried the trade of their land to Central Asia, India, and beyond, and some of the emissaries of Babylon and Persian Jews to Bukhara served as viziers in the courts of the emirs and the great moguls of India. Now listen. Historically, he feels, the Jews of Persia had their own distinction. It was through their emissaries that the Khazars of Asia Minor adopted the Jewish faith in the 8th century. So who was it who converted the Khazars? Who was it who converted the Khazars? Real Jews? Babylonian traders? Right. So So the problem is not that the Khazars were converted to Judaism and who's descended from them. It's that they never were converted to Judaism. They were converted to Babylonian heresy. Avraham Avinu, our father Avraham, and Sarah were the first converts. To be a real convert, to be a convert like Avraham, to be a convert like Ruth, is a very, very high esteemed level. Halavai alai. I wish I could get to that kind of a level. The Khazars weren't converted like that. They weren't converted by those who were loyal to the promise that Hashem had made to Avraham, that we were going to inherit the land. The land doesn't mean one geographical, it means physicality itself, that we were going to be able to express God's will in actuality, that God was going to be able to do the absolute impossible and translate. Even Ein Sof doesn't describe God. There are no descriptions for God. There are no descriptions for God. There's no conceptions, no descriptions, no nothing. It was going to translate itself into actuality and be able to be experienced in actuality. This was the plan. And it wasn't the Jews who were loyal to that who converted the Khazars. It was the Jews who were loyal to Babylon. They got to Babylon, they saw the hanging gardens, which are symbolic of the spirituality, right? It's the gardens, the flowers that never touch the ground. They sort of like hang on the vines, you know. They liked that stuff. They liked that spiritual stuff because they didn't have the moral blast. They didn't have the chops to be able to hack real Judaism. Today, there is a renaissance of the desire to return to Israel. And that does not mean I am not making a political statement. I am making an eschatological statement. I am making a cosmic statement. I am making a statement of absolute truth. There are Jews who want to fulfill the promise, the covenant that God and Avraham made, and make this world into the translation insofar as the physical world can be a vehicle for infinite holiness. This is happening. In order for that to happen, we have to clear away the crust. You know, when this thing on my lips began, happened like right around Pesach. It was really strange. Like I started like cracking and bleeding, and I said to my husband, you know, I have a feeling this doesn't feel like a biological thing happening. This feels more like a geological event. It was really, really bizarre. It was like being encrusted with sand and little rocks, and it was awful. And it was a very, very unpleasant feeling. And I said to my husband, I said to myself, something is happening. Something is going to happen. And within days, the volcano erupted in Hawaii, and there was massive volcanic activity and earthquakes all over the planet. And I knew that the Jews had reached the core. I knew that we had gotten down to the core of what Earth is supposed to be, and that there was this outflowing of burning all the garbage away. And you mark my words, if Hashem chose for that volcano to be in Hawaii, there's some kind of like really nasty kind of something going on in Hawaii. It didn't just happen. But it's not the only place that there's volcanic activity. All of that has to be cleared away. It will be done in a very, believe me when I tell you, this is under absolutely perfect control. Trust my teachers. They're very, very old. There will be floods, there will be volcanoes, there are going to be earthquakes, there's going to be a lot of seismic activity. Earth is renewing itself and purifying itself, and we are going to establish what our holy teacher Jeremiah the prophet, called the renewal of the covenant. It is not the New Testament. It is the renewal of the covenant. And please God, I'll talk more about what earth is and what that covenant is in another video. This has been long enough. For the time being, though, I wanted you to understand why it is absolutely critical that we plow down the top layer of crusting and get that out of the way. So hold on, there are going to be some upheavals, but I promise you it's all under control. And these are only good signs. Thank you for listening. And look, I can smile.